At 06:30 on March the 1st, 1943, Major Ed Larner stood on the rain-soaked coral runway at Port Moresby. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and aviation fuel. He watched his B-25 Mitchell bomber crews prepare for a mission. But this was no ordinary sortie. This was a mission that higher command had already called impossible. But impossible didn't fully capture the danger. The tactic they were about to attempt had been officially banned, not once, but twice. It was condemned by leadership as a reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. To the veteran pilots who would have to fly it, the plan was nothing short of suicide. And yet, Larner was about to lead it. The only question was, what could be so desperate that it was worth ordering men on a mission that was already forbidden? The man at the center of this gamble was Major Ed Larner. At 31 years old, he was already a hardened veteran, having flown 72 combat missions. But those 72 missions carried a deeply frustrating, almost humiliating statistic. Larner had not sunk a single enemy ship. His record wasn't an outlier. It was the norm. He was the human embodiment of the 5th Air Force's agonizing problem. Every mission, crews risked their lives. Every mission, they dropped their bombs. And every mission, the Japanese ships just kept sailing. Larner knew better than anyone that the current tactics weren't just failing. They were getting his men killed for nothing. Larner's personal frustration was now irrelevant. American intelligence had just delivered horrifying news. A massive Japanese convoy had left the fortress of Rabaul. It was 16 ships, 8 troop transports and 8 heavily armed destroyers, steaming for Leh. On board were nearly 7,000 fresh Japanese soldiers. This wasn't just a convoy. It was a strategic nightmare. Every single transport that slipped through meant thousands more enemy troops digging into the unforgiving New Guinea jungle. These were soldiers the Allies would eventually have to root out, one by one, with bayonets and blood. The clock was ticking, and failure was not an option. The convoy's impending arrival turned Larner's tactical problem into a strategic crisis. The core of the issue was that traditional high-altitude bombing was, to put it bluntly, a catastrophic failure. 5th Air Force B-17s had been trying to hit Japanese convoys for 8 long months. Their official hit rate was a pathetic 3%. For every 100 bombs dropped, 97 exploded harmlessly in the empty ocean. The failure was rooted in a simple, brutal mathematics. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from a safe altitude of 10,000 feet took 37 seconds to hit the water. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots could cover 380 yards, more than 3.5 football fields. The American bombardier, looking through his bomb sight, was aiming at a ghost. He aimed at where the ship was. By the time the bomb arrived, the ship was gone. Japanese captains weren't even panicked. They would watch the bombers open their bays, calculate the trajectory, and simply turn their vessels away from the splash zone. It was a deadly, humiliating, and completely ineffective way to fight a war. With high-altitude bombing proven a failure, General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, proposed something that sounded insane to every pilot who heard it. He wanted his crews to stop dropping bombs from the sky and instead skip them across the water like a flat stone. The theory was radical. The execution was terrifying. Crews would fly their twin-engine bombers not at 10,000 feet, but at a suicidal 50 feet above the ocean swells. They would race directly at the target, releasing their bomb just 300 yards from the ship's side. The bomb would be fitted with a 5-second delay fuse. The weapon's own momentum would carry it across the water. It would skip once, maybe twice, and slam into the ship's hull. The delay fuse would give it just enough time to penetrate inside the vessel before detonating, or explode just beneath the waterline, breaking the ship's back. It was a brutal, elegant, and seemingly impossible solution. The theorists in briefing rooms said it would work. The pilots who would actually have to fly it said it was suicide. Flying a twin-engine B-25 bomber at 50 feet above the ocean, straight at a Japanese destroyer bristling with anti-aircraft cannons, violated every survival instinct a pilot had developed. One solid hit to an engine, and the plane would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could even blink. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Higher command agreed with the pilots. They officially banned the tactic, not once, but twice, denying Larner's requests to even practice it in December and again in January. The official response was scathing. They called the idea a reckless disregard for equipment and personnel, and ordered crews to focus on proven high-altitude tactics. Larner was now in a box, facing an enemy he couldn't hit and a command structure that had forbidden his only solution. But high-altitude tactics just weren't sinking ships. Larner was forbidden from even practicing his only solution, and those 7,000 enemy troops were getting closer by the minute. He was completely out of time. If you want to see how Larner's skip-bombing experiment turned out, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Pacific War. To make the suicide run even remotely survivable, General Kenney devised a modification that would change the very nature of the B-25 Mitchell. The bomber wasn't just going to drop a bomb, it was going to fight its way in. 5th Air Force mechanics got to work. They ripped out the entire bombardier position in the nose of the plane. In its place, they installed a staggering 8 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns. Combined with the factory-installed guns, this turned the B-25 into a terrifying flying gun platform capable of putting 200 rounds per second into a target. The theory was simple: suppression. As the bomber raced toward the ship, it would unleash a torrent of lead, forcing the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to duck. It would make them choose between returning fire and staying alive, buying the pilot the precious seconds needed to line up the perfect 300-yard bomb release. With commands "no" echoing in his ears, Larner decided to train anyway. He did it in secret. He found a perfect, silent target, the wreck of the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground near Port Moresby decades earlier. Flying at dawn and dusk when observers were few, Larner's crews began their dangerous experiments, teaching themselves to fly in a way no one ever had. The learning curve was steep. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett got it wrong on his first pass. He came in too high, 70 feet instead of 50. His bomb skipped twice, flew completely over the wreck, and detonated harmlessly 300 yards beyond it. But they recalculated. Fawcett came in again, this time 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's steel hull with a catastrophic crash. It was a perfect hit, right below the waterline. Larner now had his proof. The suicide run could work. With the Japanese convoy steaming closer, Larner called his squadron leaders to the operations tent and laid out the forbidden plan. It wouldn't just be his B-25s. It would be a complex 3-layered symphony of an attack, designed to confuse, distract, and overwhelm. First, B-17 flying fortresses would come in high at 10,000 feet. Their job wasn't to sink anything. It was to force the Japanese ships to begin evasive maneuvers, breaking up their protective formation. Second, as the Japanese gunners tracked the B-17s, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters would roar in at wave-top height, strafing the destroyer decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then in the middle of that chaos, Larner's 9 B-25s, the real killing blow, would make their 50-foot suicide run. It was a plan of violent, coordinated precision. One pass, one bomb, one chance. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 agonizing minutes. Larner kept his formation at a gut-wrenching 30 feet above the ocean, so low that spray from the wave tops occasionally spattered his windscreen. The constant, deafening roar of the engines was the only sound. This terrifying altitude was their only shield. Japanese radar was ineffective at tracking aircraft below 100 feet. They were 9 ghosts, skimming the water, completely invisible to the enemy they were hunting. Radio silence was absolute. One stray transmission, and the convoy would know they were coming. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Each man was alone with his thoughts, staring at the endless blue water, knowing that the one advantage Larner had bet 60 lives on was the element of complete and total surprise. At 08:57, the first layer of Larner's plan hit. Larner watched from 3 miles out as the 13 Australian bowfighters dove on the convoy from the northeast. Their 20mm cannons opened up, raking the decks of the lead destroyers. Tracers arced across the water. As planned, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward this new immediate threat. The gunners were now looking in exactly the wrong direction. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived. From 10,000 feet, their bomb bay doors opened, and high explosive bombs tumbled toward the convoy. This was the second punch. The Japanese ships, already distracted by the bowfighters, were forced into violent evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard to avoid the bombs. The convoy's tight, protective formation instantly broke apart. The destroyers accelerated, columns scattered, and ships steamed in every direction. Larner watched the chaos unfold. It was perfect. The trap was set. Now it was his turn. Larner pushed his throttles forward and descended to 40 feet. He picked his target. The second transport in the port column, a 700-foot-long vessel sitting low in the water, fully loaded with troops. At 2,000 yards, he opened fire. All 8 50-caliber machine guns hammered at once, a deafening roar that filled the cockpit. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure, shattering glass and sparking off metal. Men on deck dove for cover. The suppression was working. The Japanese gunners couldn't shoot back while a wall of lead was tearing their positions apart. 200 yards, 800 yards. At 600 yards, the transport filled Larner's entire windscreen. It wasn't a ship anymore. It was a wall of steel rushing toward him at a combined closing speed of 300 miles per hour. Every instinct in his body screamed to pull up, to climb, to get away from the impending impact. He held his course. 400 yards! His co-pilot yelled. 300 yards! Larner pressed the bomb release. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds of explosives dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by its own momentum. It hit the water nose first, skipped once, a perfect flat stone, and arrowed directly toward the transport's hull. It punched through the steel plate just at the waterline, and Larner pulled his control yoke back so hard it rattled. Larner was climbing hard, his vision filled with nothing but sky. He didn't see the explosion. He felt it. As he fought for altitude, that 5-second fuse was counting down. 4, 3, 2, 1. The bomb detonated precisely at the waterline. The resulting shock wave hit his climbing B-25 like a physical blow, a giant invisible hand swatting the tail and throwing the 15-ton bomber sideways. His co-pilot fought the controls as the altimeter spun, 100 feet, 200 feet. Larner risked a glance back. What he saw was total vindication. The transport was splitting open. A massive column of black smoke and fire erupted from its midsection as secondary explosions from ammunition stores cooked off. The ship's back was broken. It was already listing hard to port, taking on water through the massive, ragged hole torn in its side. It had taken 15 seconds from bomb release to catastrophic damage. One bomb, the impossible banned suicide tactic, worked. Larner's triumph was only one moment in a sky erupting with chaos. The Japanese convoy was reeling. but its defenders were adapting with terrifying speed. A destroyer on the far flank, having witnessed Larner's run, had finally adjusted its guns for the 50-foot altitude. Its gunners walked their shells across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first shell missed, the second one hit. Mitchell's aircraft didn't just crash, it disintegrated. The bomb underneath its fuselage detonated on impact, vaporizing the bomber and its 5-man crew instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. They were gone between one heartbeat and the next. Then the Zeros arrived. 18 of them, silver shapes diving from 12,000 feet. A Zero latched onto Lieutenant Warren's damaged bomber. He tried every evasive maneuver, but the pilot was patient. A 2-second burst, and Warren's starboard engine exploded, sending the plane toward the ocean. 3 parachutes were seen, 3 out of 5. The suicide run had proven devastatingly effective, but the sky was now paying the price. The tactic worked, but the cost was real, and it was brutal. The full, devastating picture emerged when the reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. The images, taken from 15,000 feet, told the story Larner's scattered crews couldn't. It was a total annihilation. 8 Japanese transports. 7 were confirmed sunk or sinking. The 8th was beached on the New Britain coast, burning. 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 severely damaged and limping away. The Japanese had started with 16 ships. By nightfall, 14 were on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers who had embarked, fewer than 200 would ever reach Leh. The Allied losses? 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, and 2 P-38s. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was absurdly, brutally one-sided. General Kenney's insane idea was a catastrophic success. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't just a victory, it was a strategic checkmate. The results were so devastating that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, called it a disaster. The Japanese Navy didn't just reconsider its tactics, it fundamentally changed its entire strategy. Effective immediately, they canceled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. In just 15 minutes of sustained combat, Larner's suicide run had done what months of high-altitude bombing could not. It permanently severed the supply line to New Guinea. The Japanese garrisons at Leh, Salamaua, and Madang were now cut off. They would receive no more reinforcements, no more ammunition, and no more food. They were left to starve. The ground war and the path to Tokyo had just been irrevocably altered. The statistics were undeniable. Skip. Bombing was 15 times more effective than high-altitude bombing, achieving a kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber lost, versus 0.3 for high-altitude attacks. It had changed the war. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. They couldn't quantify the human cost. The psychological stress of flying these missions, maintaining a steady course at 50 feet directly into a wall of anti-aircraft fire, was immense. Pilots on these runs had shorter combat tours and higher rates of combat fatigue. The tactic worked, but it broke the men who flew it. And the most profound example was Major Ed Larner himself. The man who had pioneered the attack, the hero of the Bismarck Sea, refused to fly combat ever again. He requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft, flying C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat, no skip bombing. He simply couldn't stand to watch crews he'd trained die on missions he'd taught them to fly. He never spoke publicly about the battle. The pioneer of the tactic was the first to walk away from it. Ed Larner died in 1997 at the age of 85. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his entire decorated military service in just one sentence. It didn't mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It didn't mention skip bombing. He had asked his family not to discuss it, and they honored his request. In most historical accounts, it was General George Kenney who received the public credit for the tactic. That was fine with Larner. He had never wanted the recognition or the promotions he'd declined. He just wanted to finish the war and go home. The man who had revolutionized naval warfare was allowed to simply disappear into silence. It was desperation meeting innovation. It was courage measured in the decision to fly a steady course while the air turned to lethal metal. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that subscribe button. You're not just a viewer. You are part of a community dedicated to keeping these memories alive. By subscribing, you're helping make sure that Major Ed Larner and his crews don't disappear into silence. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.